Well, as we're waiting for everyone to trickle in, just like to say hello. Welcome to the third virtual gathering in the What's Next for Urban Tech Roundtable series, part of Cornell Tech's Urban Tech Hub. Hub's a new program, brings together teaching, research, and doing to develop solutions that make cities more connected, livable, and efficient. For anyone that doesn't know me, I'm Anthony Townsend. I'm the first urbanist in residence at the Hub, but as you can see here, I'm actually in residence at my own residence because of the pandemic. And I apologize for the excessive headgear. Had some Bluetooth problems, so in the name of audio quality, I'm using my backup headset today. This is the third event. The first of the two talks focused on challenges for urban tech. In September, we had Sasha Hasselmeyer from City Mart here to talk about finance and procurement and whether cities who are ultimately one of the biggest customers for urban tech, whether they're actually prepared to buy the solutions that we hope to build. Last month, we held an event with Cornell Tech's Digital Life Initiative and explored some of the many emerging ethical tensions around urban tech. If you want to go back and see video of either of those events, we have both the full reel from both events as well as a 2-minute highlight reel that can give you just a flavor of what was said, that are both at our YouTube channel, which we will post the link to during the session. And everything that we talk about is also available from the landing page for this series, which is urbantech.network. I think it's important to recognize that these were really hard but important steps tackling these issues. A lot of people were kind of surprised when I said out of the gate, like, let's talk about kind of the existential challenges for urban tech, because it's not as if we haven't had enough hand-wringing and bad news this year. But having gotten through that, we're now ready to deal with really the fun stuff. And this is, I think, the very bright future of urban tech. And starting today and over the next 4 months, the Urban Tech Hub is undertaking what we call a horizon scan, which is going to be identifying and describing the most important, most exciting trends for urban technology over the next 10 years. What are the things that we're going to be talking about and doing and researching and prototyping and inventing in 2030? Right now, what we're starting to do is deploy a variety of different listening devices and gathering signals about the kinds of things that are coming out of labs and startups and different grassroots communities around the world. And we hope to synthesize and report back sometime around March on what we've found. What we're going to do today, however, is take advantage of a really rare opportunity to look back and evaluate a 10-year forecast 10 years after it was done. Before I joined Cornell Tech many years ago, I spent almost a decade working in California at a think tank called the Institute for the Future in Palo Alto, which is one of the oldest futures organizations in the world. It's founded in 1968 by a group of researchers who came out of RAND and SRI and wanted to apply some of the methods that they had developed for forecasting technological change to in the defense world to the problems of civil society, the civil side of government, as well as industry. And one of the most rewarding projects that I got to work on during my time there, which was published in 2010, was this map of the future, which was a 10-year forecast on the future of cities, information, and inclusion. And the title of it was A Planet of Civic Laboratories. And it was commissioned by our guest today, Benjamin de la Peña, when he was at the Rockefeller Foundation here in New York City, directing national and international urban initiatives. Benji, as he likes to be called, went on from Rockefeller to be the director of national community strategy at the Knight Foundation. He went on to lead innovation work at the Seattle Department of Transportation, and now has launched his own consulting firm called Agile City Partners, where he's working on informal mobility around the world. So I just want to say hello, Benji.
Hi, Anthony. So glad to be here and excited to talk about, it's been 10 years?
Yes.
Has it been 10 years?
It's been 10 years.
Planet of Civic Laboratories, but thanks for having me.
Great. So what we're going to do is we're going to really look at 3 questions today. One is, why try to study the future at all? What do you learn Why do big organizations like Rockefeller Foundation commission these kinds of forecasts? And what do they hope to achieve? How do you do it? How do you study something that hasn't happened yet and do it in a somewhat methodical way while recognizing that there is a bit of artistry to it? And what can you learn? And what kinds of information can you extract that can inform decision making? How is this a useful tool? And I think one of the most important things that I want to get out of this, and I hope we all can get out of this, is how do we take this unique opportunity of being able to look back on an urban tech forecast 10 years after the fact to inform the way we think about urban tech going forward, and specifically how the Urban Tech Hub approaches this exercise of looking out to 2030. And to give us some fresh perspective on that question, I've also invited Scott Smith to join us. Scott is the founder and principal of Changeist, which is a futurist group based in The Hague, and also the co-author with Madeline Ashby of the recently released book, How to Future, which I think couldn't be more directly titled, which is, I think, just a really fantastic, and the subtitle is Leading in Sense Making in an Age of Hyperchange. And How to Future, we're actually using this at the Hub right now as a manual to help our students and our researchers who are participating in this Horizon Scan very quickly get up to speed on what it took me 20 years to learn how to do. Anyways, I want to say hello to Scott. Scott's going to be chiming in throughout the hour.
Hey, Anthony. Good to be here. Thank you for the invite. And nice to actually be in the same space with Benji as well for the first time. So,
wonderful.
All of you.
Great.
Hi, Scott.
Sorry. So I'd like to encourage everybody to stick around. We're going to run till 3:45. But in the last 10 or 15 minutes, we're going to shift gears from the discussion about the urban tech forecast to take advantage of the time we have with Benji to learn about his current work on what he's calling makeshift mobility, this world of informal transportation, and the evolving tech stack, which is actually very, very interesting. What in the global north we might learn from what's going on in the global south, moving just millions of people and the opportunities for decarbonization that present themselves there. So with that, I want to turn to the map itself to give you a sense of what this thing is that we're actually talking about, because it has, so Lars from our team has shared a link which you can use to access a digital version of the map on Miro. And I'm going to be sharing one as well. So feel free to follow along whatever method is most convenient. Basically, what this is it's a graphical illustration of a set of information, really about trends that we identified as shaping this intersection of cities, information, or big data, as it sort of later came to be called, and inclusion. One of the reasons we presented it visually was because at the Institute for the Future, I think around 2000, there was a pretty quick consensus gathering that people no longer read reports, and that you had to kind of give them a picture and communicate everything as quickly as you could in a picture, because that was kind of the attention span that you had. And so this format of what was sort of like a chapbook, I guess they called it. It was something that could either fit in your pocket or in a briefcase and kind of be folded out. And so what I'm going to be walking you through are the various panels of what in paper format was kind of like a multi-panel fold-up piece of paper that would fold out into a poster. So the front page, really was just trying to capture people's attention, try to evoke the sense that this is something global and it's about experimentation, and that people are really going to be interacting with technology, and that's going to be the thing that makes the difference. That this isn't just about tech. We had to make sure that people were at the center, and that was a key part of the message. This is what you're looking at now is really this is the front page of the forecast. And what we were trying to do here, I think, was to in a sense, throw a bunch of things at the wall and see what stuck with people, see what resonated. So there was a grand narrative, this idea of a planet of civic laboratories, that it was going to take a while. It was going to take, literally the next decade to figure out what this intersection, what the opportunity and what the risks of big data were for the poor in cities. We tried to highlight some of the key uncertainties, which you see in these questions over here on the left. What economic opportunities will urban information provide to excluded groups? What new exclusions might arise from new kinds of data about the city and its citizens? How will communities leverage urban information to improve service delivery, transparency, and citizen engagement? We tried to make a case to the call for action. The idea that the challenge was to harness sensory information, not just for commercial exploitation, but for economic development and inclusion, and that the response was to integrate sort of the top down and the bottom up. And then we threw this idea of combinatorial local innovation out, which was playing off a meme that was kind of in vogue in Silicon Valley at the time, that really was sort of the Web 2.0 thesis, that what was driving innovation was lots of little technological components that could be assembled and reassembled in many different ways to drive innovation. And we wanted to link that to this idea of civic innovation. So this was really sort of like, whetting the appetite for people. Why is this important, and why should you care? From there, we laid out a set of what we call technologies that matter. And this was a subset of technological trends that we were aware of at the time, that we thought were the ones that were most important for inclusion. My colleague Jake Dunnigan at the Institute for the Future called these kinds of trends continuities. These are the things that you are pretty confident they're going to continue, and you can predict sort of where they're going to end up in 10 years. They're well-known, well-understood changes. So we were looking at the shift in broadband from fixed to mobile, in personal devices from just voice to multimedia, around open data, looking at changes in interfaces from terminals to spoken and gestural kinds of interactions. And then, of course, the shift to the cloud from PCs to networked computers. And these were sort of like the baseline assumptions that carry through into the rest of the forecast. This panel, which actually, when you use the map, is somewhat hidden in, and it's really seen as like the kind of conclusion. I think of it as like the meat of the potato, so to speak, the key tensions and implications. It's a very dense panel of information. But this is really where we were trying to tease out, like, what does this thing mean? What is the significance? And we developed 3 lenses that were really admittedly vague, but part of the art of this is trying to, create lenses, slices through the map that are broad enough that, they can capture a big audience, but narrow enough that people can identify with them. Citizens, networks, and cities. So it was really individuals, groups, and cities. And I think, I'm very proud of what we did here. We asked a lot of questions here, if you go through them in detail, that are still, a lot of these are kind of ripening as we speak. And if you look around the world, these are the kinds of questions that I think are still creating a lot of tension today. And this was, I think, an area that, at least for the philanthropy, was one that we really needed to put a lot of work into co-creating. And then we have the map itself. And it has been pointed out to me several times in the last few weeks that these icons look like coronaviruses, which I guess is kind of either really good foresight or just a terrible, terrible accident. But hopefully this is resolving, because the version on my screen is still a little bit blurry. I'll zoom in a little bit. Oh, there we go. Okay. Basically, the map is a grid, and the grid has a couple different pieces to it. Sorry, I'm losing. There's a little bit of a delay with Miro here, so my grabby hand is dragging the map all over the place. So I hope it's not giving anyone vertigo. The horizontal axis tracks the scale of intervention. Okay, so people, networks, and environments. This is basically the same as the scales that we use to map the tensions and implications. The vertical axis is strategies or mechanisms for intervention: commons, markets, design and planning, and governance. Now these, you could argue, are somewhat overlapping in cases, but they were really just a tool to help group some of the domains in which urban data would be used. The big bubbles are really what I think of as solution templates. So these were formulas for how new technologies and socioeconomic trends might come together in ways that could advance a pro-poor agenda. And so each of them has a headline, it has a direction of change labeled as a from to, and then a description, and it's annotated by two sets of metadata. The little white bubbles are social and economic trends, very kind of concise, that we thought were sort of pointing towards this trend, towards this solution. And then a pair of signals, which are the pictures, which illustrate things we saw in the real world at the time that this was written, that we thought were going to, indicated what was going to become more pervasive in the future going forward. And so that's really what the map was about. And I want to shift now, bring Benji into the conversation, and kind of go back to 2010. And I think it was spring. I remember coming to the Rockefeller office just off Bryant Park. And that meeting really left an impression on me, so much so that I wrote about it a little bit in Smart Cities, my first book. And this map actually really is the foundation of that book, the narrative and much of the content. And I wonder if you could just fill us in a little bit on what was going on at Rockefeller then, what led to this project, and why this intersection of cities and big data and inclusion.
Thanks. It's just good to remember all of that map, right? So here's the context. I came into Rockefeller about 2008. That was the year they held this big summit in Bellagio, which is their leadership training center in the original Bellagio, which is in Italy, of all of these urban leaders they brought together. And that was because 2008, depending on which demographic projection you follow, was that the tipping point when the majority of the planet was going to be living in cities. That was supposed to be it. So cities was all over what we were talking about. There was a major initiative around it, trying to figure out what should we do, and a major theme really of inclusion. So that was 2008, and around that time, right? So the framing that we had is these cities are engines of opportunity, really, right? But they're also centers of exclusion, of extraordinary exclusion. Rockefeller Foundation, too famously, this is not well known, wrote the small grant that allowed Jane Jacobs to write Death and Life of Great American Cities. So $5,000, and she was given a desk in Rockefeller Foundation. And so part of me as a program officer was imagining, I'll support a lot of writers. Like Anthony walked in and said, I'm going to have him write the next Death and Life of Great American Cities. And we were talking about the future. Right around the same time, too, about 2009, 2010, IBM started coming out with its marketing for smart cities, right? understand, of course, that we had just gone through the Great Recession. And from what I understand, for most of the consulting companies, they pivoted to look at cities and governments and say, oh, there's money there, right? And so let's chase that. And really, smart cities was a marketing thing that even IBM has dropped now. And so the question, partly coming from the frame of Rockefeller and its history with Jane Jacobs, right? And the problem that engineering types tried to solve the city, right? With what we had with high modernism and Jane Jacobs' narrative of it's the bottom up and what happens in the cities example that really works. And we were working with Slum Dwellers International, really looking at exclusion in cities. And the question that came to me was, well, what's happening with all this smart city stuff? Who is already excluded and who will get excluded, and what will it mean, right, for all of this? And it was all happening fast, and I was a big fan of scenario planning. So I reached out to ITF, to Institute IFTF, and said, how about we look at this? And they sent you, and we talked, and you said, let's figure out a guide for Rockefeller to think about what are the major issues that might be coming up, so that then we position ourselves to where do we find leverage. Unfortunately, they didn't pursue that after a while. There were changes of leadership and this tends to happen in progressive foundations. But I think that map particularly shaped our thinking on what was happening in technology. There was a lot of optimism, right? Open data was going to solve a lot of things, and Code for America was just starting, and we're going to solve government because it has so many problems. And true to form, they haven't quite solved it, right? So I think that's the frame of where we were coming from and why this map was so important.
If I remember at the time, some of the preliminary research that you had been doing had sort of shaped this inquiry. There was a really fascinating case study that was some of the evaluations were coming out of projects around like digitization of land records in India. One project, which I believe was World Bank funded, called Bhumi, right? And that was kind of like, even when the good guys try to do this, presumably they can really have some unintended consequences. You want to?
So that before that, I'll talk about the other project we sort of supported and was part of this thing was Map Kibera, which was a project coming from the Ushahidi folks in Nairobi. And it was because in maps, generally, even in real maps, if you go to any city, look for where, if you open up the street map, there will be a plate that has the legend on it. And it will all usually be over the part of the city that the city doesn't want to talk about. And this was happening too in digital maps. So on Google Maps, which was less than a decade old at that time, if you looked at Nairobi and you looked at Kibera, which was one of the largest informal settlements, it was labeled as a park. So there was this narrative going on. And then what happened in Bhumi, we were not involved with that, was the World Bank wanted to solve corruption at the local scale by digitizing all the land records and aggregating them so that then you could see the whole system. This was in the state of Karnataka in India, which is where Bangalore is. And it was an expensive project. And by their assessment, it was good because it eliminated the low-level corruption that involved local land registries and people who were tenants buying off the local land register so they could sell a piece of land or say they sold a piece of land later than they did. What the digitalization did was it centralized all that information, made it harder for the local farmers to change registries. They had to go into town, which may have been 2 hours or 3 hours away, just to get registry change. And that was significant impacts if they were trying to sell land or a portion of their land to be able to pay for a funeral, say. What it did, though, was all of that digital data was not available to the farmers unless they went to the town. It was available to real estate developers in New Jersey who could then assemble land because they could see what was going on in Bangalore and buy it off. And that's why you have a lot of IT parks, right? So the narrative of information freeing all of us, and again, 2010, right? Arab Spring, all of the excitement about what social media could do and Twitter could do, and then the realization that the power setups were shifting or they were hardening, I think is part of the caution and lessons that we would pick up from this.
I should point out that the reason it was real estate speculators in New Jersey is because there's a very large diaspora community of Indians in New Jersey.
Right.
So yeah, so the idea that this presumably, digital intervention on behalf of the poor would actually empower people who wanted to disenfranchise them even more effectively. I think, looking back at that is just such an incredible, like, prefigured the centralization of data and power that we have seen. And I think one of the most valuable intellectual ahas that I had in the research for the project, and you saw this reflected throughout the language of the report, was a framework that comes from Richard Heeks, who I think was at Manchester University, that was it was like a retrospective evaluation of a decade of work in the 2000s of ICT for D. That's what the community calls itself, Information Communication Technology for Development, which is just a real collection of scholars and activists who had been trying to, in many ways, cut and paste technologies and technological solutions into the global South in order to do good. And what Heek's critical look at that had come up with, he boiled it down to essentially three kinds of efforts. They were per poor, para poor, and pro poor. And I can't remember the exact distinction between per and para, but it's basically there's like doing something for the poor, which is per poor, and then pro poor, which is empowering the poor to help themselves through technology. And it's essentially teach a man to give a man a fish or teach a man to fish kind of dichotomy. And I think it became very clear in that movement, which I wanted to reflect in how we carried this forward, that it was about capacity building and empowerment, and not mobilizing big pipelines of aid, which could potentially do more damage in addition to not just helping.
Yeah, and just related to that, right? One of my favorite conversations of all time was with Sheila Patel, who is the chair of Slum Dwellers International. And one of the things she wanted to change was you had all of these, usually architecture, urban planning students doing poverty tours on their studios, and they would show up in the slums, gather all this data, and propose solutions. And she was complaining that we gather all this data for them. We never see the proposals because they show it in their classes, and then we never see the data again. So it's extracted out of us. And in fact, one of the things that Map Kibera talked about was there's all been these reports about the neighborhood. The neighborhood never sees it. And so they started layering that on. And I think it's like the extraction of data, who holds it, and then the pro poor, per poor. I think you've got it flipped. It's pro poor is patriarchal, and para poor is coming alongside, and per poor is the poor saying this is what we want, and needing to respect that and figuring out from them what the empowerment agenda is, versus kind of this messianic, we're going to save it, solve it, both for inclusion and cities, right? So I think interesting notes, all of them.
So why don't we dive into the map and look at a couple of the forecasts that either we got right or we really blew, and see what lurks in there. I mean, it is one takeaway, that I have from just going into this material again for the first time in a long time is it just, how much richness and texture there is to it, and how out of step that may be with the times. And that as we go into this 2030 map, that we really may have a short attention span for, even hopeful messages about the future, but certainly for unhopeful, scary or complicated ones, and that we may want to boil it down. But that we may not have the opportunity to guide people through it. This map was designed for workshops and for facilitated conversations, not for people to consume on their own, because it is so dense and rich. So was there anything that when you looked back at it recently that jumped out at you?
Yeah, I think it's a interesting mixed records. That one is actionable data streams, and how with both the mapping platforms we have now, right, and social media, it's easier to show what is happening in terms of exclusion, what is happening actually in places that are not shown in maps or all of the data, right? So Raj Chetty's work, right, of looking at opportunity, all of that data that they process, his lab process, and then is available to us to look and zoom in, and the great mapping data that happens with publication. So that's, I think, really good. I think the question is actionable for me, right? It's like one of the things that we failed at in understanding was the ability of existing power dynamics to either slow anything or take over the process, right? So there's certainly a lot of data mining and analytics going on, but strangely enough, not by government. And the capacity of government to actually process and manage information is one of the things I worked at, or trying to work at, in Seattle DOT on transportation. There's a lot of transportation data, but no real plan within governments, even after a decade of open data, of how to manage all of these flows as assets and not just as records. So I think that the question of data, of actionable, right, and who acts on it is the question. I think there are moments to organize around it, and so that's great. I think we also failed going back to this power thing, right? You had one on, I like the one on I'll talk about hyperlocal soapboxes, which is really great in that it is happening with not much visibility, except that it's been kind of polarized like everything in our society, right? So you take the difference between Facebook communities that, if they are managed well, are kind of friendly enough. They'll organize the Halloween events or the pet parades and whatever, or tell people where they can get stuff. Or they could be really caustic, like next door, right? Which is where a lot of, biases and racism and whatever else happens. So I think that we were looking at that time of thinking of all these small publications coming around, all of which died. Do you remember Patch? And what was the other one? Local.us or something. And they all kind of died because they couldn't find the good income model. And then Facebook and the aggregation of these social media that allows communities to connect, and yet, a lot of it is actually not in their control. There was this really good piece from a replay in 99% Invisible on GeoCities and the death of GeoCities, and then the transition from GeoCities being a whole bunch of people building their own websites with work in progress being accepted, right? I remember the icon, a pardon our look thing, and then the kind of slick interfaces that global social media has given us. I think the other thing that we really missed the mark on was policing. Yes. Right, and we thought this would democratize policing, and it was like, oh no, and not at all, because all of that open, super, deep data, right, big data, is being used to police us even more, and taking on the biases of both the police system and, in fact, the roots of the police system, right, being carried over to these elements of control. For a while there, remember the term surveillance and what was happening during the World Trade demonstrations in Seattle and Vancouver, of people being able to take pictures and say, we identify that person immediately, or even the fact that videos are able to expose cops, right, who kill people of color, and that's helpful, but also that the existing powers that be, and the ability to take black boxes and algorithmic approaches to discrimination, and now you're encoding them into the discrimination, and people can't see what is actually happening, and as you say, well, the box tells you that, right? So I think we missed on that. The other, I think, is just the power of the private sector. We talked a lot about people's capacity and community capacity. They didn't have it, and they still don't have it, right? Some groups may have it, and usually they are well literate in computer stuff, right? But for most communities, it doesn't quite impact them the way, and they can't utilize it in the same way. And again, as I said, government capacity to actually see the systemic approaches to this thing and lay down, and this is what Bianca Wiley likes to say, right? Lay down what are the goals we're trying to do here, and not just swallow what corporate speak is taking. And I still see it in every paper I see on transportation. the really big claims of what these intelligent transportation systems will do, without realizing how we're encoding governance and making governance disappear into black boxes. So I think that was one of the other things that we missed. But otherwise, you look back and say, yes, some of these things really did happen. I like your anticipatory health.
Yeah.
I know you were going to talk about that and how exactly what's happening now.
Well, it's interesting because your last comment makes me want to go back to another. If I recall, you also had McKinsey doing kind of a parallel study back then to us, and part of I think the reason why this forecast kind of underestimated, say that the corporate power was because I think Institute for the Future and Silicon Valley, or at least the part of Silicon Valley that the Institute came out of, was always very much trying to like inspire and celebrate like the disruptive grassroots kind of cyber libertarian side of things. And I'm wondering, not McKinsey's sort of like the one to call out corporate power, but I'm wondering if McKinsey's sort of more analytical work was able to zero in on any of those issues in a more effective way.
No, and in fact, what we didn't ask them to do a forecast. What we asked them to do was do a global survey of who's doing what, and they struggled with that because there was not enough data. And I don't even remember anything about that report. But it was layered too with the same kind of technological triumphalism of the time, right? Of how these will all make things better. And you had Sasha, right? And I remember in 2010, there's already talk of we're going to change procurement. And a decade later, you were still saying we're going to change procurement. And so all of these systems, right, that exist and are very, very hard to turn or change were there. And again, a decade later, from the Arab Spring to going, oh shit, Facebook screwed us over.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So this is a good time to bring Scott Smith into the conversation. As I said, I've been doing this for 20 years, and I still found Scott's book to be like an incredible refresher, and I learned a whole bunch about what I had been doing by reading it. And I'm wondering, Scott, like, first of all, do you have any reactions to our self-assessment so far? Scott, you were one of the signalists who helped contribute content to this map when we were doing that scan 10 years ago. I'm wondering if you see any of your fingerprints in there or recall some of the things that were going through your mind at the time.
I definitely remember it. And it was a time when I came out of a decade of working in kind of tech consulting and tech forecasting before I became sort of more general futures. So I guess, I already had a kind of built-in, a little bit of a built-in sense of what institutional inertia can do, particularly because outside of the US and a lot of the rest of the world, you would see these kind of monopoly telcos kind of put their foot on market opportunity and hold it there until it was theirs. And I think, there's always this kind of issue. I mean, you sort of touched on it in that there are sometimes the sponsors or sort of contributors to this are, for many good reasons, pro-innovation, pro-disruption, very excited about the opportunities, and so don't quite take into account the sort of historical patterns that happen. I recall, and I was actually working a lot on sort of bottom of the pyramid issues at the time. It just finished a big global landscaping piece for UNICEF, looking at digital channels around the world in like 45 countries. And, there was a lot of excitement, as Benji said, around things like Ushahidi and, sort of all the participatory mapping and open data. I think the thing to kind of think about there is it's actually very, very difficult for people, communities to sustain technology application at the level that big entities, companies, cities, corporations, governments can do. So we tend to sort of assume that my neighbors are going to be as good as IBM at keeping this infrastructure running. And you're right, it's things like, you get some bright spots, but you get next door. You get the issues that we're dealing with now, Palantir, kind of owning the data. So I think those, But the key thing here is it's really, really important to do what you're doing right now, which is the retrospective, to kind of look back and not just sort of say, all right, how good of a dart thrower are we? But really, how well did you facilitate conversations that help people learn and understand things? And I think it's really, really important to kind of see the goal as being, by being able to surface these issues in a connected way and with context and continuity, that it allowed people to see a picture that they couldn't see by simply looking at little case studies here and there. How do these things connect? What could they be? What would it take for them to work? What would the impacts of the lensing you did? What are the impacts? So from that perspective, I think it's really interesting to look back, a decade, and see kind of what worked. But I don't even want to say what worked and what didn't. Yeah. It's like what was learned and what could have been, what in retrospect could we have understood differently.
So I was wondering if you could maybe say a little bit about, because the research methodology that we're using of gathering signals, which is how we developed this map 10 years ago, is also the process that we're using for our 2030 forecast. It's also the process that you write in great detail about in your book. It's a very inductive way of thinking about the future. You're sort of looking for clues and then trying to make some projections out of that. Why is this the way that futurists approach this? Why not just develop a hypothesis of change and then go out and try to validate it or test it against whatever data is out there?
That's a really good question. And I think part of it just goes to sort of the way that we tend to work, but the sort of deductive method of just kind of, posing these big theories, and then, there's a tendency to try to force them to work, to force fit deduction and kind of force fit, the sort of the 2x2 scenario matrix. Has actually very little nuance. Now, good practitioners can give it some detail and texture, but it's quite difficult because you're working from a macro theory of the world down to the detail. And I think, I came from a research background and partly a social kind of qualitative research background. So for me, being able to stitch together a larger narrative from ground level evidence seems more naturalistic. It's that kind of idea of exploring the landscape and trying to digest and explain what narratives seem to be emerging. What is it we're seeing here? What's happening? And in this case, I think you asked, we talked about this last week and kind of leading up to tonight, these ideas about, how much things have changed in terms of that process. Mm-hmm. I think that process tends to feel comfortable and can work reasonably well if facilitated well, partly because it's a process of discovery and not of proofing. You're not trying to validate an idea that has little evidence. You're trying to clarify something that emerges from the data you've collected.
So is there anything that's on your sort of scanning dashboard right now that you think we ought to be looking out for, of particular relevance, either sort of earth-shattering technological change that will sweep through cities, or urban tech trends that have come up on your radar?
On the urban tech side, it's interesting. I've actually been having a few conversations lately with people in the States because I'm here in The Hague. Mm-hmm. The Netherlands well. We've met up here before. We have forms of kind of organic, sort of feral mobility that have been around for quite a while, and the evolution is sort of smooth and interesting and diverse versus kind of watching it evolve in the US. And I was having a conversation actually with a writer from Wired about, he was asking me why this is probably preempting his article. He was asking me why, what is it that we're missing that made us not catch the sudden emergence of cycling and cargo bikes and new forms of transportation, now. And so, well, part of it is the pandemic opened a window in US consumer behavior. And also it created some interesting artificial constraints. But everything you're describing, I can look out my window and see literally from my desk right now, in a mature form. You know, the canal near me here has got plug points for EVs. We see electric cargo bikes used for urban delivery. And part of that's just, it's not because it was cool or constrained, it's just the natural way that the ecosystem evolved. And so I think there's an interesting issue around looking at this sort of both the pace layers of change and also the differentials in regions. You know, as Benji knows, and as you know, different cities in the world have mobility ecosystems that are light years ahead of others, but for interesting reasons. And I think it's important to understand what's the role of context, not just innovation. Because, you know, economics are a different issue. You know, a cargo bike for you costs 1/3 for me. So there's you know, economies of scale and all of that. But I think those kind of issues are interesting. And also kind of the role that government plays in spurring that innovation or getting out of the way of that innovation, or even dealing with things like the pandemic. You know, you have countries like Germany that are taking a very early, strong, and centralized role in controlling conditions versus those that are taking a very kind of laissez-faire, you know, I'm just next door, and the Dutch are just like, whatever, we'll see what happens. But on the kind of breakthrough side, you know, I think, you know, there's different kind of models of data analysis that could make a difference. I think, you know, things like satellite data, we haven't really begun to grapple with what that's going to look like, and when it becomes so cheap and commoditized, even more so than it is now, you know, that you can make some determinations by it. But having said that, there's only so much you can understand from a satellite view of a car park full of buses and whether or not it's moving at this volume or that volume, versus what you can collate that with on the ground as other observations that are more qualitative.
Yeah, it's funny, going back and looking at the kind of entirety of the 2010 map, the thing that really jumped out at me, like if there was a shift in the horizon, it's clear from that map that we were like, oh, sensing, the deployment of sensing, like the new eyes. And there are hints of like sense making, but it was really just about the infrastructure, right? And like now it's what do we know from all the looking, and it's how is that ability to know going to change as we go 10 years out.
And I was thinking about this while you were talking earlier, the proprietary sense making, not just at a kind of Palantir level, but every automotive provider who's built a mapping system has their own separate and independent interpretation of three-dimensional landscapes and what things are and what they mean and what they're valued at. And there's a piece I wrote last year, I think maybe last spring, about mobility span, and sort of talking about what happened when some of the Asian bike shares came to Amsterdam. The idea that, you know, that same company, if you found their bike being thrown, you know, in the garbage in, say, Singapore or Hong Kong, if you reported that, you got kind of bonus credits as a user. If you did that here, you would get thrown in the canal with the bike. And so this idea of kind of like hardwiring in value systems, you know, with the data and the technology is interesting. And that gets even more interesting when it's attached to things like financial services or belt and road development. You know, that value systems, just as US has exported its values with technology for decades, other value systems are being exported with technology the other way, which is why Trump won't allow Huawei in the security system. And those conflicts and frictions are going to be very interesting to watch.
Can I just echo that on mobility, right? Part of what we tried to do in Seattle, which it will remain a draft because the department didn't want to accept it, or the mayor wasn't interested, was exactly that, to ask what were the values of the information system that it needed to follow, right? And needed to hew to, because we could see the battle for the map and the control of who then provides you that information. My favorite example is driving from Miami to Seattle in an RV with my family to move. And I would open up a map and see this mountain in front of me, and I'd ask Google Maps mountain, and it would give me all of the names of stores or companies that had the name mountain in them. It would not tell me the name of that geographic feature because the system wasn't built to give me geographic features. It was built to give me advertising.
Well, it's not a revenue-producing mountain.
Not at all, exactly. So all of that kind of layering coming into mobility, I think, is really, really interesting. The other, just as a note on governance and the method, and I haven't asked, right, is part of we'd never asked the approach of who are giving all the signals and how representative are they, right? And that I would imagine that when we did this map, it was the technological elite that we were talking to and the economic elite, right? And so all of that views just get mixed in there. And I think as we do this more, we become more aware of who's at the table and who's speaking and what kind of informational cultures and values do we bring into the system.
Right.
We got about 10 minutes to open it up to the group. If anybody has a question or a comment or wants us to probe deeper into one of the bubbles on the map, we can try to break one of these coronavirus pods open and see what comes out. Just raise your hand. Do we have the raise hand thing? No, of course not. Can you request to unmute yourself? Did we enable that?
Or put it on chat.
Yeah, or just put it in chat and we'll unmute you. Yeah, what I'm learning, oh, you can raise your hand. I can't see the raise hand thing because, I don't know, maybe I don't have a hand because I'm a host. What I've learned about Zoom is that basically every single time you use it, it has a different set of options. I don't know if anyone else has found that, but. As we wait for people to, oh, there's Alex Pang. Okay, I'm gonna ask you to unmute yourself. And then I'm gonna lower your hand. Hi, Alex. So Alex Pang is one of the contributors to the map.
So, okay, so I want to explore a little bit more the question of how we assess this stuff, because, and it seems to me that the question of, right, you know, did we get it right or whatever is actually kind of uninteresting. What's really interesting are the questions around how did we go about thinking about this stuff so that we can do it better the next time, and how is this stuff used by other people, which in my experience, understood by them, which is, as any intellectual historian will tell you, an incredibly tough thing to do, because we don't have a lot of access to how these things get read within organizations, how they're interpreted. I mean, my own sense is that everything I did at the Institute that we did for the client was read kind of the way we framed it to them. But then once you get one step beyond that, you give it to a subordinate or to your boss or share it, and it turns into, and it's read as if, okay, so this is their prediction, right? This is what's, and so the question is, it seems to, am I missing something about this being an incredibly difficult exercise, or is there, or are there other ways to think about how to assess this, how to assess our previous work?
I mean, if I can add to the challenge of that, the spectrum of interactions I've had around the map, here are the two endpoints. 2014, I had a visit from a fellow very high up in the BJP in India who was over here on an Eisenhower fellowship, wanted to learn about the map. I walked him through it, and he told me he was going to take it back to Modi and hand it to Modi. He was so enthralled by it. And I said, regardless of their politics, that's a great impact, to have the Prime Minister of India look at this and take it seriously. So that's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is walking out of the Gray Area Foundation in downtown San Francisco. And I was talking to someone in our group waving around a copy of the map, and a homeless person on God knows what drugs walked up to us and was really, really intrigued by the design and demanded a copy of it. And so I gave it to him, and that's circulating somewhere on the streets of San Francisco in the homeless community. So that's kind of the spectrum of impact. I don't know, how you go from there to try to trace that, but that's.
Can I just say for what I wanted to use it in Rockefeller was to say, okay, so where will we make grants, right? And who are we going to look for? What are they going to be doing? And will they be attacking any of this? And to some extent, we got there with things like Code for America, City Mart, all of that. But again, foundations' attentions are fickle, and they got fickle at that point and didn't want to pursue it anymore.
Thanks for that question, Alex.
Bob Balder has a question.
Hi, Bob.
I don't know if you can hear me now.
Yes.
Good? Great. I was curious, Anthony, I was wondering about the whole topic of anticipatory health, and given where we are with COVID and the advents of a number of apps that are being used, especially in Asia, I was just curious on your thoughts and reflections on where we are and where we might be going. It seems like other parts of the world are so much farther ahead of us on tracking, tracing, and other forms of kind of communication of the virus, as well as new techniques for safeguarding the population.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't kept up on this enough to give you like an authoritative answer on that. It's definitely something that we're looking at. That portion of this map was actually mostly led by my co-author, Rachel McGuire, who at the time led, and I believe still does lead, health forecasting work at the Institute for the Future. One sort of example of like the life cycle of these things is that bubble on the map then spawned a whole nother map that was used in the Health Horizons program at the Institute. So this became like a seed for other forecasting projects. The way that I'm approaching this topic in the 2030 forecast that we're doing now, very, very loosely, is around what I'm calling in my head like the collision of urban informatics and bioinformatics. And as I'm starting to sketch it out, I'm trying to develop a cluster that links together things like the whole rewilding movement, things like wastewater sensing and the kind of genetic analysis of wastewater that has been going on, that's been so intriguing during COVID, basically like really, really early, really large scale pooled testing. And then also some of the remote sensing stuff of urban ecosystems and ecosystem services and quantification of, how much carbon sequestration is happening in Central Park. And, can we put a dollar value on that? And that becomes part of the reason why we invest in the park. I think that there's a big area there, and bioengineering and life science is not something we've traditionally really pulled into the urban tech world. And I think, if you follow what's going on in civil engineering, it's definitely something that's happening there. So that's something I'm super interested in, and has big implications for public health.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
So Sharon has a question. Can one of the panelists refer to where you think we are in terms of visible versus actionable? Can I gather a response to that?
Please.
So I think if we were going to do the map again, one of the dimensions we completely missed out on and ignored is power, right? Who has power? Mm-hmm. Who has power to have action? And we just assumed that these were kind of neutral places, right? And it was just data would move them in certain ways. But I think if we had that dimension, then who has the power in these dynamics would be really interesting. So you take the data that say Black Lives Movement or March for Our Lives is using this data to organize, right? And create the protests that we've seen, right? And so that's actionable data for them. And versus the Palantir type actionable data of who do we arrest in the middle of this demonstration. So that's the guy who painted one of the cameras, right? So I think the question is, there's a lot of it that's actionable. The question is, who's doing the action and for what?
So why don't we put a pause there, and let's switch gears over to talking about makeshift mobility for the last 15 minutes. Benji, I'm just going to hand it over to you and let you take it away and guide the discussion to the end.
Sure. Thank
Okay.
you so much for
Thank
giving
you.
me time. This has been really fun. I'll keep it brief, maybe 10 minutes, and then maybe do some action. I'm going to share my screen,
Okay.
and let's hope this happens. And then I'm going to switch over to a presentation. I did this before with UNDP, and I was 40 minutes into presenting something until they told me that they lost me 20 minutes into it. So
no, we have your screen up so we can see it.
Okay, can you see it?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so today was a big event for us. We just launched the Global Partnership for Informal Transportation. And I won't tell you much about the organization, but I did want to talk to you about what it's about, what it's trying to do, a little bit about Agile City Partners. We're trying to bring agility to cities. This is me and my team. Anthony is on our brain trust, among many other people. But basically, this is about informal transportation, and even the name we use for it is inadequate, but it's everywhere. So we got three-wheelers in Pakistan, and in India, the auto rickshaws, in Thailand, the tuk-tuks. They're in the Middle East and in Egypt and the MENA countries. They're also in Sub-Saharan Africa. They're in Latin America and the Caribbean and Southeast Asia. So they're everywhere. The four-wheelers have different names: the jeepneys, the songtaos, the matatus in Nairobi, colectivos in Latin America, marshrutkas, and I probably am saying that wrong, in East Europe, behave like matatus, right? They're privately provided transportation with a set of regulations around them, but basically allowed to exist and serve millions and billions of people. But it's not really a creature in policy and in planning. And it's not just global cities in the global south. The dollar vans, right, of New York City is informal transportation, tolerated and wanted to be eliminated, but they serve a whole bunch of people. The Vanjai in the upper right corner there is in Hong Kong, right? So they exist. And then you've got the two-wheelers, right? The boda-bodas, the ojeks, and there's a whole layer of technology coming in from ride hail. Gojek, which is a decacorn, they're valued at $10 billion, started as an ojek call center. You called so that you could book a motorcycle taxi, then became an app, and now serves about 170 million people and is becoming more fintech. So they're everywhere. And then these things are really just artistic, right? They are very expressive because they rise out of the exclusion and oppression of being ignored in terms of transportation. The photo on the right is the Golden Phantom. There actually is a competition in Nairobi every year for the best decorated matatu. And I think this one was bought by a Saudi sheikh after it won. The thing on the right is from Pakistan. Those are their minibuses. And it's an actual genre in art called the Pakistani truck art that has its roots in religion and politics. So these are expressions of ingenuity and innovation. But they dominate the cities of the global south. If you take all of the formal transportation systems we have across the world, they would be a fraction of what informal transportation systems serve. And they also serve millions or employ millions of people, usually in precarious situations, right? They serve way more of cities and even cities with formal transportation. So this is data and mapping from LSE's Urban Age. Mexico City's formal transportation system is pretty mature. They've got subways, they've got light rail, they've got one of the best BRT systems in the world. And yet popular transit, and this is a term that Jackie Klopp likes to use, serves about 74% of all public transportation trips. And in Nairobi, 70% of all commuters rely on matatus. And yet, if you look at the decision-making of, this is a term I learned from Mary Scheller, kinetic elite, right? Those who are able to move, and it's a small fraction, private vehicles. All of the investment is going to highways and cars and into mass transit, billions of dollars, which are needed in many of these cities, but are not enough, right? So we need to figure out, how do we invest in informal transportation? So informal transportation is innovative and resilient because they have to be. It's ubiquitous, but it's ignored in policy and investments, and many times in planning, it's despised, right? So when Delhi built out their 5-line metro, and they're still expanding it, Sheila Dixit, the chief minister of the corporation, said, now we can get rid of auto rickshaws, which was well intentioned, but 80% of the population used auto rickshaws, and 50% of the population couldn't afford the Metro card, and it didn't go to all the places, right? So we think we're calling attention to it because it's a powerful level to decarbonizing the transportation sector. There isn't even a global estimate of what the carbon output or GHG output is of informal transportation. So we're trying to draw attention to it and elevate it, and that's why we did the Global Partnership for Informal Transportation. Let me exit out of this and get back to you guys. If I can stop sharing the screen, stop share, there you go. And talk, right, a bit more of, so I write a newsletter called Makeshift Mobility. It's on makeshiftmobility, substack.com. I'll put the link into the chat. And I track innovations in this space. So again, it's part of this dialogue of what's recognized and what's included. The term informal transportation is inadequate because it assumes there's formal transportation and you're defining something by what it's not. The other terms we use are paratransit, which is confusing in the US because we use paratransit for assistive transportation for the disabled, but among the policy wonks, we use paratransit because it sounds like it's paralegal. It's not quite transit. Or India likes to use intermediate public transportation, but it's never clear what is it intermediate to, right? So there's this whole huge segment that moves billions, employs millions, hundreds of millions, and yet is completely ignored in policy. I was just in a futures workshop led by Arup for ADB about a month ago, and we were talking about the future of transportation. And the topic was, how do you make transportation systems resilient? And mostly they were talking about large infrastructure that had already been built or would be built that would take a decade or more to build out. And they were expensive. But no, there was no talk about how do we make auto rickshaws and tuk-tuks and jeepneys resilient, right? Because they're already resilient, and there's no talk of that. So that's what we're trying to do by drawing attention to the sector. And there's a lot of technology that's already layering onto it without, again, this dynamic of, wait, let's stop and say, what are the public goods, the community needs in terms of the information that needs to be extracted out of it and help manage the system, and how it helps the systems to behave. So much of transportation is kind of high modernist, we're going to control it. So there are cities that have tried to formalize transportation, painting them, getting new vehicles, painting them differently, and they all tend to fail because you don't solve the business model. So that's the work that I'm trying to lead and do. I'm happy to answer questions on it. So, and thanks for the time to letting me plug it. This very, very interesting work.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing it. I mean, this is something you've been working on for years as well. I remember one of the pieces that you did at Rockefeller, I think it was shortly after this map, was a piece sort of looking at like how the tech stack and the business models in informal transport were evolving together.
Right. Yeah, so we did a monograph on catalyzing the new mobility in cities, looking at innovations in service and business models. That was very early on, but it looked at the value chain, right, and where the innovations were happening. There is exactly a stack, right, that's starting to emerge with ride hail and fintech on top of it. And on the bottom of it is the physical infrastructure that is oriented towards private vehicles, and regulatory systems that are oriented towards private vehicles and treat informal transportation as traffic management problems rather than mobility problems. So really, really interesting to figure out. Again, it's like that map, right? The government is not ready, doesn't have the capacity to understand and manage transportation information so as to improve those services and change the way business is done. And that's what we're trying to get ahead of.
And who are you going to be reaching out to engage with this partnership?
So our current partners, we launched it with New Cities, which is based out of Montreal. They're a think tank and they convene. And CoMotion, which is also their partner. CoMotion LA is going on now. They have CoMotion Miami. They're sort of like the CES of transportation tech. To some extent. So we're bringing the technology people and then the think tanks. I just came from a meeting with the World Resources Institute. We've talked to the World Bank. Volvo Research Educational Foundations is very interested. So is TUMI and UNDP Accelerator Labs. So what we're trying to do is set the table and bring in the operators, people from the Global South and institutions from the Global South to talk about, really, if you want to decarbonize the system and get a just transition, do it with informal transportation, which is not to say we don't need in big cities, right, mass transportation. But informal transportation can't be an afterthought of we land the bus rapid transit or the train, and then everything has to adjust, because it doesn't work that way.
Are there any other comments or questions from the group about either the Civic lab maps or about makeshift mobility?
Can I just respond to a question?
Yes,
Someone
please.
Was asking, would Uber or Lyft be considered as popular transport? Uber has more auto rickshaws in India than they have cars. So, yes.
So they've been moving in and trying to sort of co-opt the existing dispatching.
They have, but there's this really interesting narrative. So it solved the dispatching and the mapping and knowing who's driving it. But now auto rickshaw drivers, particularly in Kerala, have started using WhatsApp to communicate with passengers so that they bypass the 37% cut of Uber. And using their community, right, to be able to direct. And you have the same mapping systems anyway without having to go through Uber. So it's interesting, the dynamics of the innovation and then counter innovation and who gets to use what. There's
some interesting intersection with the whole platform cooperatives movement, which Trevor Scholes and a group of people at New School University have been pushing for the last couple of years. They did a conference last year, and they had a couple of the really successful large ones from Brazil. There was one fellow gave a presentation, and it was, I think it was trash collectors. It was a network of self-employed trash collectors who had pooled resources, built their own app and dispatching platform that they own. They shared the profits and they controlled their work. And it had gotten so successful that they had sort of left the API a little too open, and a venture-backed competitor had entered the marketplace, scraped all the data out, and then, essentially bought out, like with a cash incentive, all of the workers who were participating in the platform, open platform, the cooperative platform version, and sort of scalped the whole thing. And it was to me, like, really was this terrible signal of just like the power, to come in and sweep these things away. Really interesting, because the call centers for auto rickshaws or OJECs were not a new thing. There's a whole bunch of them coming up around the time we did the map. Nirmal Foundation in India was very celebrated, and they were focused on improving the lives of the drivers. And then you get the new ride-hail ones who had connections to funding, right? They could do venture cap. And both of them, Nirmal and OJEC, came up with apps as well as a few other call centers. And yet, because you had a lot, because OJEC and Grab had access to venture cap funding, they were able to bring in more resources and do that blitz growth thing, right? And so it killed which is not to say they weren't trying to improve the lives of the drivers too, but the Nirmal Foundation and other groups in India were primarily focused on improving the lives of drivers. So really interesting, again, the power dynamics and who has the resources and how do you then intervene, right? Great. Well, that seems like a good place to stop. I want to thank Benji. I want to thank Scott for joining us. I want to thank everybody else for joining us as well. A recording of this will be posted shortly to the urbantech.network site. It takes us a couple days extra to produce the highlight reel. And our next event will be on December 15th. It'll be hosted by Michael Samuelian, the director of the Urban Tech Hub. And it will be about defending density, the future of urban systems in New York City. And we'll have a panel of speakers speaking to some of the challenges and opportunities facing New York City as it pulls itself out of the second, third, fourth wave of pandemic over the coming years. And I hope you all join us, and thank you very much. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks.